Tonight's story is about a man who buys a used RV and learns, almost immediately, that the previous owner left behind more than clutter. At first, it's ordinary. Photo albums, receipts, a stack of notebooks shoved where no one would look twice. But the handwriting inside doesn't read like memories. It reads like practice, like someone rehearsing the same terrible moment until it finally sounds clean. Then he reaches a page where the writer stops calling it a nightmare and starts calling it something he did. And that's when the buyer understands. He isn't reading a diary. He's holding evidence that stayed hidden for years until it chose him. He didn't mean to read anything. He'd bought the trailer cheap, an RV squatting behind a storage lot, outside town, sun-bleached, a little soft around the seams, the kind of purchase you justify by telling yourself you'll strip it for parts or flip it or park it on land someday. The previous owner was dead. That was the whole reason it was for sale. The man who sold it barely met his eyes when he handed over the keys, like the thing had mood and you didn't want to carry it home. Inside, the air was old fabric and stale sweet rot, soda spill that never got scrubbed out, damp plywood, the flat odor of cigarettes soaked into everything. The buyer moved slowly, careful where he put his boots, because the floor flexed in a way that suggested secrets. He wasn't looking for keepsakes. He was looking for paperwork, ownership stuff, warranty booklets, registration slips, anything that could bite him later. The front dinette had been turned into a nest of papers, mailers, photo envelopes, yellowing receipts, folded napkins with phone numbers written in ink. He opened cabinet doors and drawers and found more of the same. A life reduced to paper and trash. Then he lifted the cushion on the bench seat, just checking, and his hand caught on a stack of spiral notebooks bound with rubber bands. Not one. A pile. He sat down without thinking. He pulled the top notebook free. The cover was plain, cheap, drugstore blue. No title, no name. Just a thumbprint smudge in the corner where someone had held it 1,000 times. He cracked it open. The handwriting was tight and slanted. Like whoever wrote it didn't want to waste space. The ink had sunk into the paper so hard it looked bruised. He skimmed the first page, half expecting grocery lists, addresses, ordinary mess, and instead saw words that made his throat tighten. They don't understand what's inside me. The dark thing follows me even when I'm sober. I tried the candles. I tried the shape on the floor. I tried to bargain. There were lines about demons and monsters, about being watched, about a deal offered and refused and offered again. It was dramatic, almost theatrical, until it wasn't. Because the writer stopped talking about feelings and started talking about something he had done. The buyer's eyes snagged on a sentence that didn't sound like fantasy at all. It sounded like a man confessing while trying to disguise it as something else. And in that moment, sitting in a dead man's trailer with the sun going down outside, he had the sudden, sick certainty that these notebooks weren't just the ramblings of an unstable mind. They were a map. And somewhere inside them, buried beneath all the talk of darkness and devils, was the truth about a woman who had been dead for decades. A woman whose town had never stopped arguing about who killed her. A woman who, depending on who you asked, was either the tragic center of a mystery or the proof that sometimes the most dangerous thing in your life isn't a stranger outside the door. It's the person who already knows where you keep your spare key. In the summer of 1987, Stephenville, Texas, still had that small-town confidence. The kind that comes from routine, from believing the worst things happen somewhere else, to other people. In bigger places with nastier streets and names you only heard on the news. Stephenville wasn't a paradise. It had its divorces, its drinking, its grudges, but it also had people who recognized your truck by the way it idled, and waitresses who didn't need to ask what you wanted because you'd been ordering the same thing since high school. Susan Woods lived there, 30 years old, and trying quietly, stubbornly, to begin again. That's the part people forget when they tell her story as a headline. They remember the end. They remember the arguments. They remember the name that got whispered for years like a curse. But before all that, there was a woman alone in a small house, rebuilding her life by inches. She had been married young. Not a fairy tale, not a nightmare, just the slow, ordinary unraveling of two people who stopped being kind to each other. And when her husband left, it wasn't clean. It wasn't adult. It wasn't the kind of separation where you divide furniture and wish each other well. It was abandonment. He went to Indiana and took things that mattered. Her car, certain keepsakes, little objects she had collected that made her feel like the world was wider than factory shifts and bills. He left behind a tape recording, cruel notes hidden around the house like landmines. Insults folded into drawers, tucked under the edge of a mirror, slipped into places she wouldn't find until she thought she was safe. The notes did what they were meant to do. They made her house feel haunted. Not by ghosts, by intent. For a while, she couldn't sleep. She kept imagining the front door opening, the familiar sound of his boots, his voice in the hall. She made herself laugh at the thought, then cried anyway. She asked her best friend to stay over. She asked her friend's boyfriend to nail the window shut, not because she thought nails could stop a man who wanted in, but because she needed to hear herself taking control of something. Control became her religion. She worked overtime at a sandpaper factory, hard, repetitive work that left grit under your fingernails even after you washed. And she did it because it was simpler than sitting in the quiet house listening for sounds that weren't there. Each extra shift was a brick in a new wall, a car fund, a way out, a way forward. And she had Cindy Hallmark, later Cindy Hayes, depending on what point in the timeline you met her, was everything Susan wasn't. Loud when Susan was soft. Social when Susan was shy. The kind of woman who didn't let you disappear into yourself because she'd show up at your door and insist you come with her. Cindy had a boyfriend named Roy Hayes, a big man with a big laugh, someone who could fill a room just by standing in it. Roy didn't talk much about feelings, but he did things. If someone needed help moving furniture, Roy was there. If a tire blew out on the side of the road, Roy was there. If Susan needed her windows nailed shut so she could breathe at night, Roy showed up with a hammer like it was nothing. Cindy and Roy were the ones who dragged Susan back toward people. They had a circle, a cluster of friends and cousins who met up regularly, usually around Cindy's kitchen table, drinking, talking, letting the night stretch until it turned into morning. They jokingly called themselves the Round Table, like they were knights and not just tired young adults trying to feel less alone. Susan resisted at first. She'd sit there with her hands around a cup, watching everyone else talk over one another, feeling like she was trespassing. But then something happened that always happens when a lonely person is offered real, consistent kindness. She started showing up again. And again. It began to feel like a lifeline. So when Cindy and Roy suggested they go out one Friday night, get out of the house, do something normal, Susan said yes. They drove to a fair in Hyco, Texas, the kind of local fair that smells like dust and fried sugar and livestock, where the lights are too bright and the music is always a little distorted. Kids screamed on rides. Teenagers clustered near the games, pretending not to care whether they won prizes. Somewhere, a generator hummed like a second heartbeat beneath it all. It should have been harmless. But Cindy, standing at the gate with Susan and Roy, said she had a feeling she couldn't shake. Not a thought. Not a worry she could explain. A physical thing. A pressure under the skin. Like something bad was about to happen. Susan tried to laugh it off. Roy tried to tease her. But Cindy's eyes kept scanning the crowd as if she expected to see a face she recognized for the wrong reasons. Her smile didn't hold. Her fingers wouldn't stop moving. And in the end, Roy said, "Let's just go home. We'll drive around a bit. Then we'll hit Dairy Queen." It sounded like salvation in a small-town way. They left the fair, climbed into Roy's truck, and headed back toward Stephenville. At the Stephenville Dairy Queen, the world shrank to something warm and manageable. Booths, plastic trays, the soft clatter of spoons against glass bowls, the air conditioning humming loud enough to drown out any lingering dread. Cindy's anxiety faded as quickly as it had come, like a summer storm rolling away. Roy made her laugh. Susan found herself laughing too. Surprised by it, almost embarrassed, like she had forgotten the sound of her own joy. For a few minutes, it felt like the last 6 months had been a bad dream she could finally wake from. Susan watched Cindy teasing Roy, trying to shove a spoonful of ice cream into his mouth, while he protested with exaggerated horror. Chocolate sauce streaked his chin. Cindy was grinning like a kid who'd gotten away with something. Susan smiled so hard it made her cheeks ache. Then, in a moment of impulsive rebellion, something she would have been too self-conscious to do a month earlier, she stood up, walked to the counter, and ordered another sundae. A second one. She carried it back like a trophy. Cindy and Roy stared at her, delighted and impressed, and Susan felt the strange, bright relief of not policing herself for once. Not measuring, not shrinking, just existing. It was such a small thing, which is why it hurt so much later for everyone who loved her, that this was one of the last uncomplicated pleasures she got. The weekend swallowed her the way weekends do when you're trying to keep your life together. Saturday was factory work. Sunday was chores. Laundry, groceries, cleaning, resetting her house into something that felt like hers. By Sunday evening, around 8, she had done everything she could do. The bed was made, the laundry was put away, the last clutter from the floor was cleared. Her house was small, nothing fancy. But there was pride in the order. Pride in the fact that she'd survived the leaving. Pride in the fact that the hidden notes were mostly found, mostly removed, like she'd been pulling splinters out of her own home one by one. She sat on the couch and turned on the TV, flipping channels lazily. She planned to watch a couple of shows, let the quiet settle into her bones, then go to bed early for the work. Peace was the goal. Then she heard a knock at the front door. Not a pounding, not frantic, just a knock. And because it was Stephenville, because it was Sunday night, because people knocked on doors all the time, because she didn't want to live like a trapped animal, she got up. 2 days later, Susan's manager called her father. Joe Atkins didn't hesitate. The moment he heard Susan hadn't shown up for work and nobody could reach her, he grabbed his keys and drove to her house with the kind of dread that doesn't feel dramatic until you realize it was right. When he pulled up, he noticed something that should have comforted him. The TV was on, loud, audible from outside. But when he knocked, no one answered. He tried the doorknob. Unlocked. Joe stepped inside and called her name. The house looked mostly normal. Snacks on the coffee table, an open soda can, the TV playing to no one. But then his eyes caught on an ashtray full of cigarette butts. Susan didn't smoke. That detail, small, stupid, domestic, hit him harder than the silence. It was the first thing that told him the house had been occupied by someone else, someone who felt comfortable enough to sit, eat, smoke, and leave their refuse like they belonged. He moved down the hall toward the bedroom. The bed looked wrong immediately. The sheets were ripped off and heaped on the floor. The mattress was shifted, half off the box spring, like the room had been shaken. Joe stood there trying to make sense of it, telling himself it could be anything. Maybe Susan had been sick. Maybe she stripped the bed to wash it. Maybe... Then he noticed the bathroom door standing open. He moved toward it as if his body was being pulled. He looked inside. And whatever he saw, whatever detail his mind chose to lock onto, stole the air from his lungs so completely that for a few seconds he didn't move at all. He backed away on instinct, stumbled to the living room, grabbed the phone, and called 911. The first responders arrived to a house that looked too ordinary to hold what it held. Police cars, fire trucks, an ambulance. The blue-red flicker of lights on a quiet street that had no business being that loud. An investigator named Donnie Hensley arrived and saw Joe Atkins standing outside. Joe wasn't just a grieving father to Hensley. He was someone he knew, someone he'd prayed with before in better circumstances, someone whose face he recognized from town life, the kind of familiarity that, on a normal day, would have been comforting. Hensley walked up and asked automatically, "Joe, what are you doing here?" And the moment Joe turned, Hensley understood. Whatever was inside that house had already destroyed a man in the front yard. Hensley didn't have words that would help, so he took Joe's hands, and the two men stood there and prayed, because sometimes prayer is the only thing left that isn't a lie. Inside, the crime scene was processed in pieces: living room, bedroom, bathroom. The front door showed no sign of forced entry. There were snacks on the coffee table, multiple cigarette butts, signs of company. And then there were the windows, nailed shut from the inside. Someone had helped Susan fortify her house. Someone had taken her fears seriously enough to put nails through wood and glass. And yet the door had been opened, which meant, at least to the investigators standing in that living room, that Susan had either trusted the person she let in, or she'd been convinced she had no choice. In the bedroom, the mess told a story without words. Struggle, movement, panic. A white extension cord lay on the mattress, meaningless on its own, but ominous in context. The kind of object that becomes something else when violence enters a room. A pillow showed dark smudges that looked like mascara, evidence of a face pressed hard against fabric, a desperate effort to breathe. In the bathroom, Susan's body was found in the tub, and the scene was brutal enough that even seasoned officers had to pause and steady themselves. But brutality, for all its horror, is not always the same thing as intelligence, because the killer left behind something more enduring than fear. Palm prints, clear enough to lift, clear enough to haunt an evidence box for years. In the first days, everyone in Stephenville decided they knew who did it. That's another small-town ritual. A tragedy happens, and people reach for a familiar villain. It gives shape to the chaos. It gives you a name to blame. It gives you a story that feels solvable. Susan's estranged husband, Michael Woods, was that name. He was the one who left. He was the one who took things. The one who left cruel recordings and notes. The one Susan had been afraid of, enough to nail her window shut. He was also, inconveniently, living in Indianapolis. And while people talked about alibis, what they really traded was belief. Belief that he must have done it. Belief that distance wasn't a barrier if obsession was strong enough. Belief that cruelty always escalates. But belief isn't evidence. And evidence, at least at first, didn't land where everyone expected. Suspects were discussed. Names circled. A bartender Susan had briefly dated. Roy Hayes, enormous and physically capable, who had been at her side so often it was easy to imagine him in any scene. Friends of friends, cousins of cousins, men seen in trucks. The case moved in fits and starts, then slowed, then stalled. It didn't help that early investigative momentum was uneven. Pieces missed, assumptions treated like facts, follow-ups delayed, and when the official file was later revisited, the absence of thorough documentation felt like a second betrayal. Not just that Susan had been killed, but that the effort to find her killer had been allowed to thin out with time. Years passed. The palm prints remained. The cigarette butts remained. The town's certainty remained too, clinging hard to the idea of Michael because letting go meant admitting the killer might be closer than anyone wanted. And that possibility is harder to live with. Because if the killer was close, if the killer was part of the same social gravity that pulled everyone together, then safety had never been real. It had just been familiarity. In 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller with the Stephenville Police Department took Susan's case down from evidence storage. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a movie moment. It was a man pulling a box from a shelf because part of his job was to review unsolved cases, and because something about this one wouldn't stop echoing through the department. Miller read what was there. He studied photos. He tried to feel the shape of the missing work. What had been done, what hadn't, where time had chewed holes into the investigation. Two things stood out to him immediately. First, the palm prints. Second, the cigarette butts. In 1987, technology had limits. Databases were smaller, more local, more dependent on already having a suspect to compare against. Evidence could be collected perfectly and still sit useless if you had nowhere to send it. By 2006, that had changed. There were fingerprint systems that could search wider. There were DNA advances that could pull identity from things that used to be too contaminated, too degraded, too small to matter. Miller didn't have the budget for a full reinvestigation from scratch, but he had enough to do something the original case hadn't benefited from. He could ask the evidence new questions. He pursued DNA analysis from what had been left behind at the scene. He pressed forward with the prints, sending them into a system capable of reaching beyond Stephenville's borders. And then, slowly, the case began to shift. Not with a single thunderclap, but with that quiet, awful sensation of realizing the story you've been living with for years has been pointed in the wrong direction. The prince came back with a match. Someone arrested in another state, another time, a name that meant nothing to most people in the case file at first glance. Miller dug into the match's history and started threading the name through Susan's orbit. That's when it clicked. Not because the name was famous, not because it belonged to a stranger with no ties, because it belonged to someone who had been close enough to Susan that the door might have opened without fear, close enough to sit on her couch, close enough to drink her soda, close enough to smoke in her living room, close enough to blend into grief afterward, close enough to be present when her casket went into the ground. Miller brought the man in for questioning in early June 2006. The man denied killing her. He admitted being at her house before. He spoke in vague, self-serving fragments, the way people do when they want credit for honesty without paying the price of it. But the evidence, DNA, fingerprints didn't argue. The man was arrested and charged. His name was Joseph Scott Hatley, a member of the wider circle around Cindy Hallmark, Cindy Hayes, someone Susan knew through family ties and gatherings, someone who had been at the edges of her attempt at rebuilding. In 2007, Hatley pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 30 years. For Susan's family, it was resolution, the tangible kind, a conviction, a sentence, the state acknowledging what had been done. But resolution is not the same thing as understanding. Hatley did not offer a clean motive. He did not give the kind of explanation that lets grief settle into a shape you can live with. The story people wanted, rage, jealousy, obsession, remained partially obscured behind his evasions, and time, in its indifferent way, kept moving. Hatley was released from prison in 2018 after serving 11 years. In 2021, he died of cancer. And then, after his death, something happened that made Susan's case feel alive again, in the worst way. Because death did not shut Hatley up. It just changed the method. Back in the trailer, the buyer kept reading. He told himself he should stop, that this wasn't his business, that curiosity was a kind of trespassing, but the words had their hooks in him now. Page after page, the writer described a life shaped by alcohol, anger, and a persistent sense of being wrong inside his own skin. He described the way ordinary people looked through restaurant windows, happy, connected, and how that sight didn't inspire him so much as it provoked him. Like their happiness was an insult he couldn't ignore. He wrote about fear of abandonment, but not in a tender way, in a predatory way. Like he believed the world owed him closeness, and when it didn't give it freely, he could take it. He wrote about darkness as if it were an entity, but sometimes, between the supernatural language, he admitted something simpler, that the darkness was him. And then, finally, the writer reached the night that had frozen Stephenville for decades. He described driving through town in a brown pickup, drinking a mixture of soda and liquor and cough syrup, trying to keep himself numbed, trying to keep himself brave. He described thinking about Susan, not as a person, not as a woman with her own interior life, but as an image, a smile, a moment of kindness, the kind of small human interaction Susan offered because she was gentle. He described convincing himself that meant something, that it was an invitation, that it was permission. He described going to her house. He described knocking. He described her opening the door. Surprised, then polite, then trying to be normal, because normal was what she had been chasing all summer. He described sitting on her couch with snacks and a Coke, smoke curling into the air of a house she had tried so hard to make safe. He described leaning in, making his move, and he described Susan pulling away. In his telling, her refusal wasn't just rejection. It was humiliation. It was an unbearable correction. The world reminding him, again, that he did not get what he wanted just because he wanted it. He described her slapping him. And then he described something that made the buyer's stomach turn. Not because it was graphic, but because it was familiar in its ugliness. The writer called it rage. He called it fog. He called it madness. He tried to call it anything but what it was, a choice. The buyer didn't need every detail. He didn't want them. The diary gave enough. A struggle. A frantic, violent escalation. A woman fighting for her life in her own home. A killer using the privacy she'd offered him as the weapon. And afterward, this part was the most chilling of all. The writer described leaving. Not fleeing like a hunted man. Leaving like someone who had returned to his ordinary life. He wrote about the tub because the tub, to him, was both scene and symbol. He wrote about touching it, about water, about trying to wash something away that couldn't be washed away. He wrote about demons again, but now the buyer understood. The demon talk wasn't an explanation. It was camouflage, a way of shifting responsibility onto some outside force because the truth, that he had done this because he couldn't tolerate no, was too naked. The buyer closed the notebook and sat there in the dim trailer, hearing nothing but his own breathing and the faint ticking of cooling metal somewhere behind the walls. Then he did what most people hope they'd do in that situation, but don't always. He made a call, because these pages weren't just confession. They were residue. They were the last cruelty of a man who had taken a life and then tried, even in his own private writing, to turn it into mythology, anything but accountability. The detective who received the call had already solved the case years earlier. The state had already done what it was going to do. Susan was already buried. But when those notebooks surfaced, they did something evidence hadn't been able to do on its own. They made the motive feel close enough to touch, and that closeness was its own kind of horror. Because the simplest truth, the one that haunts harder than any occult language, was this. Susan had built walls, nailed windows shut, worked overtime, tried to reclaim her life one careful ritual at a time. And in the end, the thing that breached her home wasn't a stranger breaking glass. It was familiarity. A knock at the door, a choice to be polite, a moment of ordinary trust. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.